Let's just dive right in, shall we? If you're studying philosophy of religion, you already know we're about to step into an absolute philosophical minefield, the problem of evil and the major theodicies. It's a massive topic, so we're going to distill exactly what you need to know for your A-levels, the strengths, the weaknesses, and the big thinkers, all right here in this explainer.
Okay, here's your roadmap. We'll kick things off with the core problem of evil, look at the modern arguments against God, break down the Augustinian and Irenaean theodicies, and then wrap it all up by putting those two head-to-head in a final comparison.
So part 1, the problem of evil. This is really the core threat to classical theism.
J.L. Mackey's inconsistent triad gets right to the heart of the logical problem here. Think about it. If God is entirely omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, and totally omnibenevolent, all-loving, then how on earth can evil exist? It's a classic logical trap. These three statements literally cannot all be true at the same time without completely contradicting one another.
And hey, this isn't just some modern headache. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus actually first formulated this whole logical problem of suffering way back in the day. Later on, Thomas Aquinas pointed out that since infinite goodness is basically essential to God's nature, the existence of even the tiniest drop of evil totally ruins the possibility of that infinite goodness. Then you've got David Hume. He argued that only two parts of the triad can actually exist simultaneously. So for Hume, either God isn't all-powerful, God isn't all-loving, or, well, evil doesn't exist. But since we all know evil definitely exists, the God of classical theism is kind of in deep trouble here.
Right. Let's move on to part 2, modern arguments against God. This is where we hit the evidential problem of evil.
Now, if you get an essay question asking you to compare these approaches, and you probably will, you really need to nail this crucial shift. The classic logical problem from Epicurus and Mackey, it basically says the mere existence of evil makes God impossible, full stop. But the modern evidential problem, brought to us by thinkers like Rowe and Paul, well, it shifts the focus completely. For them, it's not just about the fact that evil exists, it's about the staggering, immense scale of it all and how unfairly innocent suffering is distributed. To put some names to it, William Rowe looks at the sheer physical evidence of intense animal suffering in the wild. I mean, he argues that it has absolutely zero philosophical or theological basis in classical theism. Gregory S. Paul takes a similar route, pointing out the absolute immensity of premature deaths throughout human history. The takeaway here? These aren't just fun, abstract logical puzzles anymore. These arguments use hard, physical evidence to directly challenge the whole concept of a just God.
Okay, section 3. How does classical theism fight back? Let's look at the Augustinian theodicy, or defending God through free will.
Augustine's defense follows a really precise, kind of brilliant logic. Step 1. God creates a totally flawless, perfect world, ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. Step 2. We humans come along and ruin it through the fall, using our free will to sin. Step 3. Evil enters the chat. But here's the real genius of Augustine's argument. He says evil isn't actually a thing that God created. Not at all. It's a privation. It's just an absence of good, kind of like how darkness is literally just the absence of light. And this setup, it makes our current world soul-deciding, which means the choices we make right now absolutely determine our eternal fate.
And honestly, this brings up a fantastic quote you can drop into your exams from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Writing in the 18th century, he took Augustine's aesthetic argument and pushed it even further. He claimed that, out of every possible universe imaginable, God couldn't fail to act perfectly, and so he chose to create the absolute best possible world.
So what are the strengths here? Well, the crucial point in favor of the Augustinian approach is that it is highly consistent with both the Bible and the God of classical theism. Thinkers like Alvin Plantinga back this up with the free will defense. Plantinga essentially says, look, without genuine free will, we humans would just be robots. For our choices to actually mean something, both natural and moral evil have to be on the table. And that neatly makes moral evil entirely our responsibility, not God's.
But wait, there's a massive, explosive trap waiting in his defense. Augustine's whole theodicy relies heavily on the concept of ultimate judgment. But you know, we run into a huge moral contradiction when we try to square an omnibenevolent, endlessly loving God with the actual existence of eternal punishment in hell. It's a really tough pill to swallow.
And honestly, the Augustinian approach suffers from some pretty glaring weaknesses in the modern era. Scientifically speaking, the whole idea of all humanity descending from just a single pair, Adam and Eve, is biologically impossible. That kind of throws a wrench into the idea that we literally inherited Adam's original sin.
Then, logically, the concept of a completely perfect world just spontaneously becoming chaotic, that completely contradicts our geological and biological evidence. Plus, obviously, this raises massive questions about reading Genesis chapters 2 and 3 as literal historical fact.
Okay, let's pivot to section 4, a completely different strategy, the irony in theodicy, or the veil of soul-making.
Now, this approach is radically different from Augustine's. Step 1 here is that God creates humans imperfectly from the start, and crucially, out of pre-existent matter, not out of nothing. Step 2, earthly life is basically designed as a veil of soul-making. In this view, suffering isn't some divine punishment for the fall. Actually, it's a completely necessary tool to help us develop toward moral perfection. Step 3, because every single person is on this developmental journey, it ultimately results in eschatological justification. In plain English, that means eventual universal salvation for absolutely everyone.
You definitely need to know this key term developed by the modern philosopher John Hick, epistemic distance. Hick argued that God deliberately created a world where his presence isn't overwhelmingly obvious. And why would he do that? Well, because if we knew God was standing right there watching us every single second, we'd only ever do good out of pure fear. So, this epistemic distance gives us the actual breathing room to make genuinely free, responsible moral choices without being totally overwhelmed.
What's really fascinating about this theodicy is its modern credibility. Unlike Augustine, the Iranian view is highly compatible with the scientific reality of evolution, because it frames humanity as a literal work in progress. It totally bypasses the whole logical nightmare of a perfect world spontaneously turning chaotic. And by ditching that ex nihilo creation idea, God isn't entirely on the hook for introducing evil. But maybe most importantly, it gives our earthly suffering a recognizable developmental purpose. It allows us to build what we call second-order goods, things like deep compassion, which, let's face it, simply couldn't exist if suffering wasn't a thing.
Now, that all sounds great in theory, right? But we really have to stop and ask the tough question. Does the Iranian approach actually survive the grim realities of modern history? Does the concept of soul-making honestly justify the sheer immensity of innocent human suffering? Well, the weaknesses here are incredibly significant. First off, for Orthodox Christians, the whole concept of universal salvation is seen as unbiblical and honestly deeply unjust. If everybody gets a free pass to heaven eventually, doesn't that kind of devalue Christ's sacrifice and the whole need for forgiveness of sins? Plus, if final perfection is literally guaranteed no matter what, it makes our moral behavior here on earth technically pointless. But the most devastating critique is probably the issue of proportion. If suffering is really just a lesson, why is there just so much of it? I mean, couldn't humanity have learned compassion without something as horrific as the Holocaust? The immense quantity of suffering seems totally out of proportion to whatever developmental rewards we're supposedly getting.
To really cap off this critique, the philosopher D.Z. Phillips delivers an absolute crushing blow. He basically argues that it is fundamentally immoral and just never justifiable to harm someone or let them be horribly victimized just to help them or somebody else develop morally. It's a really powerful counterargument.
And that brings us to section 5. Let's put these two side by side for the ultimate comparison.
Okay, this is the absolute anchor for your exam revision, so pay close attention. It perfectly maps out the contrast. For creation, Augustine says we started perfect and were created ex nihilo, while Irenaeus says we started imperfect from pre-existent matter. For the purpose of life, Augustine calls it soul-deciding, but for Irenaeus it's a veil of soul-making. Where does evil come from? Augustine says it's a privation caused by the fall, whereas Irenaeus argues it's an absolutely necessary tool for our moral development. And finally, our ultimate destiny, Augustine sticks to traditional heaven or hell, but Irenaeus gives us universal salvation. Oh, and don't forget the modern viability aspect. Augustine clashes pretty hard with modern science, while Irenaeus is actually quite compatible with evolution. So, having navigated the evidence, the logical traps, and these massive philosophical defenses, we're going to leave you with a final, provocative question to really fuel your essays. Does the undeniable existence and sheer scale of evil definitively prove God's non-existence? Or do these theodicies, flaws and all, actually provide a successful defense for classical theism? Something to chew on. Good luck with your revisions, and keep wrestling with those big questions.